Episode 28 of the New England Sports Media Podcast. We're actually heading to Madison, Wisconsin to check in with our buddy Josh Schafer, who is a Mansfield, Massachusetts native. So that is his New England connection. Josh is the Wisconsin or one of the Wisconsin beat reporters for I don't know if is it 24/7 or 247. I think it's 24/7, but our friend of the podcast Matt Dory says 247.
And we've been debating that for years.
So what's the
I've been
official?
told 24/7.
All right, good. Sounds good. 24/7 Sports.
And that's what I said.
By way of Syracuse University and Mansfield Hornets. Shout out Mike Redding.
Absolutely. Love Coach. Big Twitter follow. He's one of my favorite Twitter follows.
So we're going to get into it here with Josh, chop it up about kind of what he's done so far. He's a 2020 college grad like Liam and I, so get right into it. So Josh, tell us right now, you're in Madison. You've been there for quite a few months now, a handful of months. What is your just experience like moving away from home, like just for this job? I know you went to LA for an internship and stuff, but like, what's this adult life in the Midwest been like?
Yeah, it's definitely different as far as, I guess I'll start with saying it's different than I would have ever anticipated because of the pandemic, first of all, which everything's different, but moving away was definitely different. For instance, you just mentioned that I was in LA at one point for an internship for the summer. I was there for 12 weeks, which was a long time to be by myself too. But you could sort of hang out with people and go and do things and leave your lonely apartment, and you saw people every day at work. I don't really have that luxury here. I see people at games. We've been able to go to home football games and home basketball games. Now, granted, I think there ended up being 3 home football games, if I'm not mistaken. Half of them got canceled anyway. And so it's basically a constant battle of myself trying to figure out how to get out of the house for kind of no reason, because my job just requires my laptop and for me to call people. So there's really no reason. I'm not really doing any in-person interviews right now. Everything with, I cover Wisconsin basketball and football, mainly men's basketball. And everything with those 2 teams is pretty much via Zoom. Even when you go to the game, you just get to watch the game in person, but then you Zoom with them after. So it's very pandemic era style living, but it's been good. I drove around today just to check out the frozen lakes, looked at some people ice fishing, which is kind of funny. It's just like sometimes I'll make a point to, before it gets dark out, just go outside. And when it was warmer out, I could actually do things outside, like go biking or something. Now I'm just kind of, I go for a walk or something quick or drive and try and act like it's a little bit normal.
For sure. So tell us, so you go to Mansfield High, you go to Syracuse, you kind of do the standard like internship thing that we all did. You interned at Yahoo Sports last summer, and then you get to March and we all go home or whatever. So like, what's going on for you then? Like for me, I had an internship that got canceled and then I ended up with a different job. So like, what's going on for you then, and how do you get to where you're at now?
Yeah, so I had actually been talking to 24/7 before coronavirus was really what it turned into. I think I started talking to them in February. And so we had gone back and forth a little bit, but like nothing was set in stone. And then the pandemic happens, and I'm like, well, I'm going to guess that they're not just going to go hiring a bunch of people like with this uncertainty. And so I sort of just started, I kept in contact with them and then just kept looking for jobs. And I know, Greg, I talked to you about it multiple times. Like there's just weren't really jobs appearing, right? You go on job boards and there's just kind of nothing there. And so once, I think the last internship that I was a finalist for that I heard got canceled was in April. And that was when I was like, okay, I'm definitely totally screwed. And so what am I going to do? I did the Big Scribble. That was a writing contest that Jeff Perlman and Miran Fader and a couple other journalists ran, which was fun, kept me busy for a couple weeks. Obviously finished out school and kind of just hung out and was like, okay, I think it was probably June where I was like, I'm probably never going to not work for this long again in my life. I might as well just chill. So I kind of hung out for the summer. I did a part-time freelancing gig with Premier Lacrosse League, which is a new lacrosse league that started up, which was fun. But in general, I looked for jobs, but maybe not as actively as I would have if it wasn't the pandemic. I kind of took the pandemic as a sign that maybe sitting on the beach for a week wouldn't be the end of the world. And I did that a little bit as well.
So what about like now that you're in Wisconsin, what has this job been like? I guess Yahoo was a fully like online publication. I was gonna ask about kind of like the difference of, newspaper versus online, but you have experience with that. So what's like the daily grind like? What's your schedule like? How many articles are you putting out per week? Like what's a week in the life?
Yeah. So to start, what I would say, Yahoo was different because I was an intern. I went into the office. So while my schedule was probably moderately comparable to what I do now to some extent, I had people that had eyes on me all the time. So you like totally had to be doing something from, I think my hours were 10 to 6. It was normal standard hours versus now I do not have normal standard hours. Pretty much I get up, I try and write 2 or 3. I would classify them as posts per day. They're not always stories. Generally they're stories, especially during football season. I had never covered, at Syracuse, I covered football and basketball and other things. But when you cover a school like Wisconsin football, we had availability Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then a game, and Thursday, actually. Interviews Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and a game Saturday. So the news cycle is constantly churning and you're constantly talking to people. So you're just kind of banging out stories. And then usually by the afternoon, so Zooms would be in the morning. By the afternoon, I'd probably, if I was looking to do a feature, do something a little bit different than what we Zoom for that day, I'd do a phone call or two on that. And that's pretty much what my day was like. I get up and do a blog or something, or do a quick post, and then do whatever I wanted in between that and interviews right through. And that pretty much takes you through the day. And then it kind of is, the ball is in my own court as far as what kind of features I want to work on. If I want to put more effort into something and make calls kind of after hours when people get out of work and they want to call you and that sort of stuff, which I did do sometimes. But then there were other days that I was like, that was 8 or 9 hours of stuff. I'm going to hang out and watch some Netflix and do what I feel like. So it's different. My boss is always there to reach out to, and so is my B partner, Evan, as far as if I want to run ideas by them or have them look at something, they're always available. You're not in the workplace with them, so they don't know that you want them unless you ask for them. That's the most different thing that's been interesting to adjust to, I think, because you kind of have to reach out, because it's not like someone's just walking by your desk and is like, oh, how's your day going? Or like, how are these views? It's very, very remote, and you have to be kind of a self-starter, which I'm used to anyway. I think it's comparable to working at your college newspaper to some extent, because no one was watching over you then, right? You kind of had to just decide what you were going to do and decide what was right.
What's been your opinion of Paul Chryst so far, working with the media? He seems like a total character. Like, you see like the tape on the mask and everything. How has he been with the media, and how has your interactions been?
That's the other thing that's been so weird about this beat, is just not meeting anyone in person. Like
Right.
my square just suddenly popped up in the press conferences. And after a while, like, they knew what my name was, but the first couple of times, I don't know who they thought I was or whatever. So that whole thing was weird. But Paul has very dry humor, and when it hits, it's hilarious. The other day, so I don't know if you guys saw, Wisconsin won their bowl game, the Duke's Mayo Bowl against Wake Forest, and
Big
the
win.
quarterback Graham Mertz dropped the trophy. And so Chris gets on, and someone, of course, asked him about the trophy because it's already on social media, and I don't think they knew that the video was out there. So he's like, well, I don't have to say anything because I'm not under oath, but let's just say everyone wanted a piece. And I was like, oh my God, that's unbelievable. And so that's a good example of his humor, I feel like, and kind of how he rolls. In general, he really doesn't say much, which I don't think is that untypical of a Power 5 coach from a team that's usually in the top 10 or top 15. He's not going to come out and say something ridiculous. He's not really looking to create a headline by what he says, which I think maybe some coaches in, say, the SEC do. That's not really how he rolls. So you kind of got to know going into it. You can ask him about stuff, and there are certain boxes you can check about asking injuries or something, but he's not just going to say something Dan Mullen-esque, and you just get to write about that for the day.
I'm kind of curious too, just in terms of like moving right now and, like living in a new city and meeting people in terms of a job where you're doing it mostly from home? Kind of how has that been? What's that experience been like?
Yeah, moving itself was pretty normal. I probably would have driven out here anyway, and because I wanted my car. So I drove out with my mom, and then my dad flew out and met us. But like the moving process wasn't that weird. The only thing that was a little bit odd is I didn't get to see an apartment in person before I moved in. You kind of just had to do virtual tours and then just roll with it, and whatever you got was what you got. I like my place, so that was good, but it was definitely is risky, I guess. Making friends and stuff has been interesting. Wisconsin is not as closed up as Massachusetts as far as restaurants and stuff, and kind of never was. It was pretty bad here in October and November, to the point where, do whatever you want, your own discretion, but it seemed like COVID was everywhere. But yeah, sometimes I'll just go out there's like a couple, I live above a brewery, which isn't bad.
Oh, nice.
It's a good setup. And then there's a
Yeah,
couple other good sports bars like right around me. So if Wisconsin doesn't have a game, or there's good Friday night college football or something, I'll just like go and eat by the bar, talk to the bartenders and talk to a couple people around me and just kind of hang out. Like I said, I think that would be more normal if there wasn't coronavirus, but it hasn't been awful. It's been fine.
Yeah.
So you mentioned like your face showed up on these boxes and like Paul Chryst knows who you are potentially or whatever. Like, have you felt like you've been able to sort of make your presence known on the beat, or like what's that been like in terms of people knowing who you are? I mean, I think obviously social media is such an important part of this job anyway, and a lot of times, especially like college kids might know who you are based off of social media to begin with, Twitter, Instagram, or whatever. So like, what's that been like trying to kind of assert yourself or build sources or whatever?
Yeah. The biggest thing for me in press conferences is just to try and ask a question if you have one, but also have a question. I'm not saying that my motto is like, I'm just going to make up a question before this press conference, but also if you sit through a press conference and never ask questions, then no one's ever going to know who you are. And then if you write total junk about them, then people aren't going to be happy because they're going to be like, who is this random person that sits on my Zoom, takes what I say, and then says this about it? So I think that's important. It's the same thing as like we were always taught, like just show up to the press conference every day. Like don't miss. As long as you're there, then you can kind of slowly establish yourself that way. So I've tried to take that mantra. I'm new to this job. I'm only 3 months into it, but that's sort of how I've attacked it. And then I've hopefully tried to do something different than some other people on the beat are doing. The one advantage of Zoom press conferences is you know what everyone's story is when you hang up, and it's pretty obvious. So you can either say, okay, this person mentioned this trainer, I'm going to call them, or think, everyone might call that trainer, I'm going to try and do this or that and just do a completely different story. There are some days that I can tell what 2 or 3 people's stories are leading up to the game, and I'll maybe do a quick story on it, but not spend too much time on it because I want to do something different. Like for the Northwestern game, I called Joe Gaziano, who listeners of this podcast would probably remember. He played at Severian and then went to Northwestern, and a couple other Northwestern defensive linemen, and asked them what it's like to play against Wisconsin's offensive line, because that's an overly physical game. And I figured, hopefully, that no one else in the Wisconsin beat was going to spend part of their week just calling 3 or 4 former Northwestern players. There was no quotes from anyone from Wisconsin in that story. So then if you could do something different like that, then you're establishing yourself to readers that like maybe you're a place that people want to go because it has something different. So that's kind of how I've taken it. Don't really know if it's worked. Hard to tell this early, but we're trying.
That's awesome. That really sets you apart. How big is the beat? Like how many people are on the Zooms? How many people are asking questions?
So the main papers are the Wisconsin State Journal, which is also Madison.com, and then the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. I think I pronounced that right. And so those guys each have a beat writer, and then there's a crossover beat writer for Wisconsin State Journal, Jim Polsey, who does a great job that covers men's basketball primarily, but also does football. So he's on both those. I'm 24/7 Sports. There's a Rivals writer that's on all the Zooms too. And then there's 2 main TV stations in town. So it's usually just a rotating bunch of someone from those 2 stations. And then because it's Wisconsin, well, I guess there's columnists too. So I don't know, like 8 people normally, and then there'll be a national person that pops on for Chris or something, or Jim Leonard every now and then, and ask them like a trend question. But in general, it's like a 4 or 5 person rotation, and it literally just it's a straight up rotation. You know where you are in the order. They run through the line, and then like the 2 guys that have been here for a while usually ask 2 questions at the end, and that's just kind of how it runs. So you basically get 1 question, which is kind of hard.
Are the message boards still a thing with 24/7? Like, is that still a big deal?
Oh, yeah.
Are you what's it been like communicating with those people? I bet you might have had some similar experiences at Syracuse because there's a pretty good fan base for like their basketball program. But like, what's the kind of like the Josh Schafer and fans vibe looking like these days?
I think the funniest part of the whole thing is I can't figure out how old all the people are. Like, I think there are some people closer to our age, but there's obviously like people that are well older than us. And so sometimes I'll like talk on it like I'm texting, but other times I don't. And I can't tell like what goes over well and what doesn't, or if there's stuff that I'll say that if people just read and they're like, why is this young kid even covering this team? Or why is he typing like that? But I try and just keep it loose. They're all pretty sarcastic. So I think it's pretty funny, honestly. Like half of it is comments about what's actually going on in the articles of the games. And then the other half is just like, it's kind of just a place for fans to sound off on what they're feeling. And then they end up just throwing in a bunch of PJ Fleck, like sinking on a boat gifts. It's just like kind of funny. And so that part of it, I've honestly really enjoyed it because like we already talked about, I mean, I live alone. I don't always do that much. So sometimes it's fun if like the message board starts going off on something, like it's entertaining to read. And then I try and involve myself in it, but also to a professional level, of course.
And Wisconsin had one of the more kind of peculiar like football season with the 3 games getting canceled and all that. What was it like for you? Like, were you trying to like break news and break like who was going to be out over the course of it? Or what was it like following a team where like they didn't play for 3 weeks?
I tried to poke my head in where I could, but I kind of knew I was going to lose.
Yeah.
I was just like, if I show up here and in 3 weeks somehow figure out how to do this, then like I would really be surprising myself. So yeah, I mean, I put in a little bit of effort there, but it was a lot of just try and figure out what's going on, try and think of another way around it. I told myself I was going to file FOIAs and then just didn't do it because life happened. Wish I did, but would have been a good idea. But I was thinking about things like that and just trying to figure out a way around it. But yeah, it was weird. Seriously, like I did not really have many sources to talk to. You hear the starting quarterback who just like lit the country on fire with a Friday night, like primetime performance, got COVID the next day. And I was just like, oh, this is how this season's going to go. Nothing's going to make any sense. Great. I'm going to have no idea what's going on. And that was pretty much how it went from there on out. And then Wisconsin didn't even end up having that good of a year. It seemed like they were going to be good and they totally tanked too, which was a fun time to be on the message boards. When your team has lost 3 straight games, people start going off.
So you got to do a little bit of traveling. I know we texted when you went over to Ann Arbor. What has been just the press box, either home or road? You kind of touched on the experience a little bit in terms of like how you're not really like talking to people even when you're there. But can you kind of describe for people just like what is it? I mean, I haven't been to a game since March. Like, what does it feel like to be at these games? Is it weird?
It is weird. I wrote a column on the first football game that I went to after, just like saying that I miss the fans for no other reason other than simply the roar, right? I'm sitting there typing on my laptop furiously the entire game. How many times have you looked down and almost missed a play? And then like the crowd's going nuts, especially in football. The second that receiver's open, you know the receiver's open because the crowd's freaking out because they're all way up in the nosebleeds and they can see that no one covered the kid. And like that aspect is just so much fun. So that was definitely missed. As far as literal press box sitting and stuff, I got used to bringing my own coffee and remembering to do that. Most places didn't do like coffee or food or anything. And I'm a big coffee guy when I'm covering games. So I had to start remembering to bring that. And a snack too, because football, you're there for a long time, which can kind of stink. But it's like masked up. Every place was masked up, and you're just probably more than 6 feet away. I'd say you're like 8 feet away. And so you're almost half yelling to someone if you're like, who made that tackle or what, like you're like kind of yelling, which is funny. But I did get to talk to some people. That was how I met some of the other people on the beat and stuff, just especially from traveling, because it's one thing when you're in the home press box, but then when you're away and there's only 2 or 3 of you guys obviously know each other and you don't know anyone else. The Michigan press box was probably the weirdest one just because it's so big and the stadium's so
Dude, isn't
big.
that press box?
Just
I covered a soccer game, like a Premier League game there. Dude, that press box is absurd. It's like a palace.
yeah. Yeah, the press box is nuts. I'd say Clemson had a similar press box because they're in the ACC. We went down there and it's probably semi-similar. But yeah, no, that press box is enormous. And to have, I mean, they probably cut out 2 seats in between people, something like that. Like that's the amount of people that they're letting in. So it's weird. But basketball is fun because you can hear the music better. Football, because of the glass, you can't hear the music. So basketball, I always like most teams have good pregame playlists and stuff, and it's fun to sit there while you're like starting to write your story and stuff, and you can like bop to the music a little bit, and in between timeouts you can hear it. So basketball is not quite as weird, other than the fact, of course, like the bench are the only people making any sort of noise, which is just really odd in game.
So you mentioned like the travel. Like when you were at the Daily Orange, you cover football, you cover basketball too, and you guys were traveling too. That's awesome.
Yeah, we went to every game. I mean, not me personally, but football, the rule was Clemson was our furthest drive. That's 13 and a half hours from Syracuse. Anything else is a flight, which the only places further than that would be Florida State, which I flew to. And then if they were to play at Miami, there's not another Florida school that I'm missing. Oh, Georgia Tech too. They could play Georgia Tech in football technically. I went down to Georgia Tech for basketball. What would you say?
Did they play at Louisville?
We drove to Louisville.
How long was that?
Louisville was 10 maybe? 10 or 11, I think.
That's all.
And it's usually like 2 or 3 of us in the car. Like, because the reason we drive too is so we can afford to bring 3 people, 2 writers and a photographer. Because once it turns into a flight, you're only going to send one person. And then you're only getting so much out of it. And the road trips were fun too. Everyone says that was some of our favorite stuff at college, was just driving, stopping in random places. We used to always eat at this burger spot in West Virginia. The Copper Still Pub. That's what it's called. They have a good good bacon cheeseburger. People there.
So I'm curious, like, you don't have to say what they are, although I don't think anyone's giving anything away, but do you have any like ideas for kind of like when you finally get that shot of vaccine in your arm or whatever, like story ideas that you kind of want to pursue in person in Wisconsin? Like, are you thinking about stuff, whether it's like going to maybe see some really old alumni from the football team or something? Are you thinking about kind of like what a post-pandemic stories that you just can't do right now?
Yeah, I have like a mental list. I should probably write them down. That's a good idea, actually. But I've thought about that a bunch because I always think about what's the furthest that someone would let me go with a mask. Like as far as like, what's the best idea I can think of that someone might actually be down to do a social distance interview for that I could like be a part of? And because now the question is going to be, and I think this will be different for sports media in general moving forward, is what do we actually have to be there for? Because I think people have built up a really strong argument now for, well, just call me. I call everyone. Just call me. And I think all 3 of us would probably argue you just have a better conversation in person and the interview is going to go better. But people aren't going to understand that as subjects. So what are things that I actually want to like go and watch and stuff? Like, yeah, that's definitely something I'm thinking about as the off season's coming, and kind of what different stuff can you go see in an off season, right? And I don't know if there'll be camps and stuff this summer. Does that stuff start to come back? How does basketball off season go this summer? Is it more normal? I hope the summer is a little bit more normal and we're just at stuff in person, at least as a media. I'm not expecting like AAU gyms to be full this summer, but I don't know why we won't be back to regularly all those games and that kind of stuff too.
Right. So the last thing I want to touch on is, I know that you may not be the lead on recruiting for them. I think your beat partner Evan might be, but what is, I mean, like 24/7 obviously is a huge recruiting service too, like nationally and for teams. So like, have you done, I mean, I know you've done some reporting on recruiting. How's that been for you? I'm sure 99, actually 100% of it is all virtual now, especially during COVID. So like, what's your approach with that? I sometimes I like doing recruiting stuff and sometimes I hate it because I just feel like I'm copy and pasting the same type of message to some kid who I'm never gonna meet. So like what's your kind of relationship with that and how have you been doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely, you were kind of getting at it there. I'd definitely say Evan is our lead recruiting person and crushes recruiting, but I've dabbled in it because, I mean, it's 24/7 sports. We do
Yeah, you
recruiting
have to, like if you're covering
100%,
college
100%.
sport, you
We
have
had
to.
signing day. And I was like, how can I get involved in this? And sort of my approach was doing a couple different feature stories on like talking to kids one-on-one, which I think, like, you guys know from covering high school sports, like sometimes you call kids and they're just not good interviews and sometimes they are. It really just depends on how many times the kids talk to someone, I think, and like if they won in Call of Duty earlier that day or not. Like, it can be super hit or miss. But yeah, I think that's the most difficult part. I think you hit it nail on the head there, is talking to 16-year-old, 17-year-old kids over the phone. It's like not really that easy. No one's that good at talking on the phone at that age. You're just not really used to it. Everyone texts now. 16-year-old kids aren't calling their friends. Maybe they're FaceTiming them, but they're not really calling their friends.
Yeah,
So I
it's
think
like a blind. Everything that you do with recruiting reporting is blind. Like you're just going into it hoping that like kid X sees your DM, or like the parent answers
yeah,
DM, or like the coach hits you back on your email. It's also, I don't know, something, and I think I've talked about this on every single time we've talked to someone about recruiting, is like I hate doing recruiting reporting in a lot of ways because it's so inauthentic. Like we were talking our last podcast, we had um, a couple of brothers, Aaron and Andrew Robinson, who played basketball at Quinnipiac and then Coppin State, and they're like in sports media now. And they basically said, like, when we were transferring, we got Goodman, we got Borzello, we got whoever, all hitting us up in the DMs, and it's just like, sometimes it just seems like, okay, like you get that list, you copy and paste it, you're hearing interest from there, and you're done. It's kind of a weird thing, and like I think if you can make like an actual relationship from a recruiting story, like that's a big win because there are probably a lot of people hitting up these kids.
yeah, I think that's something that 24/7 is usually good at in general, as far as kind of being human to the parents and being human to the kids. And so how I've sort of been able to dip into a lot of the recruiting coverage is because someone like Evan or some of our national writers or someone legitimately do know people. Like, they don't just have their phone number. They've talked to them. You can say, hey, so-and-so gave me your number. And then they're like, oh, I talked to them the other day. That's great. So like having that connection is huge. And 24/7's network, when it comes to that stuff, is very, very vast. But I do agree with you. I always wonder sometimes why kids respond, or like what's in it for them. I know like there are plenty of instances where there is something in it for them, but if you're transferring from like, I don't know, Quinnipiac, and like, where are you going that like you're getting a ton out of letting that information out to answer like 15 DMs?
Yeah, and all these kids too, like, I mean, because of Instagram, because of everything, they just make their own. Here's my top six. Like they don't need reporters.
Is that where sports media is heading? There's your next podcast.
I don't know about that. We'll see.
Are people going to write their own stories?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think people might ghostwrite stories for people. That's definitely in the cards now, of course, Players Tribune, etc. And then I'm sure it's in the cards in the future. Um, that was all I had, but I do want to ask one more thing because you mentioned it, is kind of like the 24/7 Sports Network. You're kind of in a scenario here, in a company here that has a huge footprint, right? Like you're not working for the Wisconsin State Journal, for instance. I don't know if they're owned by a bigger parent company, but you're not at like a place that only covers Wisconsin. Of course, that's all you're covering right now, but what type of resources or opportunities or collaborations have you kind of seen from the 24/7 network? I'm curious if there is a lot of kind of overlap or people working together because of how wide the reach is.
Oh, 100%. I mean, this week's a good example because like the transfer portal's been busy, right? And we have some people that pay way more attention to that than other people. And so you can communicate with someone like that that really knows the transfer portal well, right? And you're just kind of dipping in there because some guys are starting to get thrown around in there. You have experts on that. You have experts on recruiting. And so a national recruiting and trends. So you can kind of go to an immediate resource, like you have them on Slack or there's a contact list for the companies. So you can immediately talk to them and sort of get information that otherwise, if you were a general reporter, you'd probably reach out to someone from 24/7 Sports for, especially when it comes to recruiting. People use people from our site as experts.
Yeah, I use in Detroit. I use Steve Wiltfong on a story.
Yeah. Right. And so like that stuff is awesome. And it's connected to CBS too. And they have CBS HQ, which streams live like 24/7 or something. It's crazy. And so whenever things get national, you can sort of work up the chain. And you see that with the teams that are in the college football playoff and stuff. Obviously, I don't think Wisconsin, unless Wisconsin basketball were to pop off and go to the Final Four, which I mean, they're good this year if they could. But I think the football team's a little bit away from doing anything that's like truly national interest. But we'll see. When basketball has stuff that becomes national interest, you for sure can get 24/7 Sports front page or work your way into doing some CBS stuff if they need it, because you're now all of a sudden the on the ground expert for a big national company.
No doubt, no doubt. All right, the great Josh Schafer. Also, we forgot to mention he's a fantastic cook, at least by the stories on his Snapchat and Instagram.
We've been grinding. That's I should have mentioned that. That's what I do now. Now that I've moved out here by myself, I just cook. Because if you cook a full meal, it takes like an hour, and then you have to clean it too. So it's the best time killer of all time.
That's the biggest lesson for everyone that listens to this is you should learn how to cook because it's a good way to pass it.
It's a good way of looking at it.
It's so sad.
All right, Josh, thanks so much for joining with us.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate it.